Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff I'll Never Tell You, a production of iHeartRadio. And today we are so thrilled to be joined by friend of the show, contributor to the show, friend IRL, Joey. Welcome,
Hello.
Joey.
Thanks for having me. Oh my God, I'm so honored I got the friend IRL title now.
Yeah.
Yes.
We've officially all met.
We were recently in New York and we have officially all met IRL. Even though I was like, oh, really? We haven't already?
And to be fair, I had met Joey a year before, so just saying. In the IRL.
That is
just
true.
saying.
That is true.
Not to put that as like a competition or anything, but you know.
Samantha, geez. All
Correct.
right. Okay.
Never forget.
You won't let me. So,
Of course.
Yes. I'm very excited to talk about this, Joey. There are a couple of things we're going to have to come back and revisit with you soon. One is that since being a guest on our Sex and the City episode, you have since binge watched all of Sex and the City, correct?
I did. And that is what I pitched this episode as. It's not a Sex and the City episode, but it is also kind of a Sex and the City episode because, again, yeah, you guys had me on your show back in spring and I watched one episode. And then like a couple weeks later, I was like, now I'm just curious. I need to go back and watch like the first couple episodes and see what the show is really about. And then cut to like 2 months later, I had seen the entire show. And yeah, I will say, I did make a note in my outline here that says, apologize to straight women, because I'm so sorry. I did dismiss the show for a very long time as it's for straight people. I'm not watching this. Why would I watch Sex and the City? That was fantastic. I'm sorry, straight women. I forget y'all have some serious game when it comes to the rom-com circuit. I don't know.
I like it.
But something again, I think like something that really, because this show really, really stuck with me. I will say like, this is a weird year. This was a weird summer. This show was maybe one of the things that was keeping me sane this summer. And listeners, this may shock you, but I am currently single. And, you know, obviously a reason you guys talk about the show and a big reason why it holds up and it's still so popular is because a lot of these experiences are so universal and still hold up and are still sort of things that I've experienced. I've seen my friends experience, you know, even when you cut through all the weird 90s stuff that doesn't hold up super well or, you know, the way dynamics have changed, it's still something that at the end of the day, like, very clearly resonates. And so anyways, this is the other thing is I finished the show and immediately went, I could do that.
I love this. I love everything. But first of all, let's talk about the power of streaming and how it really does bring back old series. Because this would have never happened. We would have maybe, to be fair, syndication happened. And that's part of the reason I got into Sex and the City because I never originally watched it. But then I watched the syndication when it came out, the very like edited version of Sex and the City. So it's always kind of been there. Mm-hmm. But this level, like where you can actually binge it and not have to wait. I think I actually went after I watched it in syndication and bought the DVDs, not even playing. Like I went and bought every single season on DVD because I was also that person without streaming. And this is how old I am. I have them somewhere. But I just love that it also is relevant enough. Like there's still things that's outdated, but the other things is like, yeah, that line hits too hard. And you're like, this is 30 years old, 20 years old. Why do I think this is relevant?
Yes. Samantha, I've already told you why. It took me a little bit to finish the last season because of some parallels that were happening in my life. But yeah. I will say, I do remember distinctly like going to the library and getting the DVD version of like the old seasons of Doctor Who when I was in high school because I think streaming had just sort of started up then, but my parents were like, no, we're not paying for this. So I have gotten the DVD set. I have had that experience.
That makes me feel better.
Yeah. But and then kind of to go back to hopefully not making y'all feel too old again. I was going to say the other thing about the show that really stuck out to me was there was a moment watching it where I realized like something that I find really interesting, because it is interesting, of course, to see the things that are similar and the things that have changed. But in terms of the things that have changed, I realized I was kind of raised by the generation of women that would have been around the same age as the characters or like in their 20s, 30s when the show was coming out. And so I think it is really interesting to see how much like the expectations and sort of conversation around dating and sex and marriage and all of that was for me growing up, and how much of that was not putting, you know, too much on this show, but that this show was really something that I think was like showcasing that conversation on a mainstream sort of platform for kind of the first time, and really like allowing women to have these conversations about sexuality and dating. And so, yeah, once again, this episode's premise is me coming in and being like, I think I could be Carrie Bradshaw. And then every moment I sat down to write this, doubting myself and being like, who am I? Who am I to pretend like I know all there is to know about dating? And then remembering that Carrie is also very bad at dating in the show. So I think maybe I'm perfect for this. That being said, obviously dating is such a strange thing to write about because it is such an individual experience. And it's hard to make general claims. Again, even kind of what I've said so far about like how like the conversation about dating when I was growing up, obviously that's going to be different for each individual person. Like I grew up in a fairly progressive environment. I think like that really affected how that kind of came across in my life. Was raised by a feminist mom, you know, and also there's all these, you know, there's different social factors that affect how we date and who we're dating and where we're dating, etc. So I don't mean this to be like a generalization. This is more or less kind of supposed to be me commenting on what I'm seeing in the statistics, what I'm seeing in my life, and what I'm seeing from talking to my friends. So for context, I'm in my mid-20s. I live in New York City. I will say, personally, I don't have a strong desire to get married. It would be nice if it happened, if I found the right person, but it's not like my number one priority, I think, when it comes to dating, which I think has definitely been a big difference that I've seen. I'm bisexual. I've dated people of all genders. Personally, and I'm going to get a little bit more into this later, I have kind of made it a boundary for myself. I only date other queer people. So I don't date straight men, which has been interesting, to say the least. But all of this obviously affects like how I date. Because yeah, again, like somebody who's listening to this, who if you're a straight woman listening to this, you're going to have a very different experience than I am. If you're a gay man listening to this, you're going to have a very different experience. If you are like a lesbian who only dates women, have a different experience than I am. If you're somebody who's cisgender, you're going to have a different experience. But again, something I came across when thinking about this summer and talking to most of my friends about their dating lives, everybody seems super miserable. And some of that is just a given. Some of that is the fact that being a young person and trying to date is always going to be hard, and especially in the world we live in now. But I do think there's something that's like changed about dating culture, for whether you want to say for Gen Z or just for like 2024 dating culture or whatever. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's just different. And again, I started by talking about Sex and the City because I think watching that show, it was coming out at a time where we also were seeing these norms changing and the conversation changing. And we were seeing these characters try to navigate those changes as they were happening. And I think, again, those changes weren't necessarily bad. I would argue they were for the best. I think like at the end of the day, anything that leads to people being more sexually liberated or just like personally liberated in their identity in their life, like that's a good thing. But it's new. It's a new landscape to navigate. So this is my attempts to break down some of these changes. Going back again to the end of the summer, there was this moment where there was a story that was blowing up on social media about how New York City is supposedly the worst city to be single in. I found a number of like serious news publications that wrote about this. There was a Time Out article about it. It was all over Twitter. you know, it was a fun thing to share, especially if you're single, just being like, see, this is the problem. But at the end of the day, it kind of confused me because, look, it's not like it's great being single in New York, but I will say, I think like it is a city where there are a lot of young people. There's a lot of single young people, and there's a lot of things happening where like you can go out and meet other people that are also single and maybe have similar interests than you. So I don't know, at least to me, I was like saying it's the worst city to be single in felt a little bit like a stretch. So I did some research to find this actual survey. Turns out it's from a site called Fetish Finder, which is primarily a BDSM blog. I have not been able to find the actual survey with the like concrete results and who they were interviewing and who, whatever. So Fetish Finder, if you want to reach out to me and send me the full study, I'm happy to look at it. But I will say this sort of made me pause for a sec because I was like, this doesn't seem right. And then, so I did find a article from Secret Philadelphia that was talking about this survey because Philadelphia was also listed as one of the worst cities. And they did say that researchers conducted a survey that focused on 6 key metrics. And that was 1, population of single people, 2, likelihood of marriage, 3, the annual divorce rate, 4, the rate of individuals actively searching for a relationship, 5, quality of living, 6, cost of living. Those last 2 I'm not going to talk about because that is, okay, that's understandable. But the thing that really stuck out to me was this emphasis on likelihood of marriage and divorce rate, because at least to me, I was like, I don't think, like that brings up the question, is wanting to get married and stay married and not get a divorce, like, is that necessary to have a healthy romantic and sexual life? Like, to me, that seems sort of obsolete. Like, I feel like the divorce rate in the city I'm living in is not going to affect how a 20-something-year-old is going to, like, go about going on first dates, you know?
I wonder what was did they say where the best place was to date? Did they say what city was the best, or did you note that?
It was definitely, I remember I was surprised because they were like they basically listed just every major city as like a bad city to date in. I was like, okay, yeah, top 10 worst cities. It says number 1, New York, number 2, Los Angeles, number 3, Philadelphia, number 4, Chicago, number 5, San Antonio, and then Fort Worth, San Diego, Houston, Phoenix, and San Jose. So Atlanta, you guys did not make the cut. Congrats. But again, to me, this just kind of looks like a list of some major cities.
I think one more reason for you to move to Atlanta, it seems.
Oh, yeah, sorry. This is actually...
Just saying.
Exactly. That's the takeaway from all this. I did find a New York Post article where they talked about this survey. And in the survey, they talked to 2 people that sort of were like, yes, exactly, that's so right. The 2 people they interviewed were a 23-year-old and a 24-year-old. And they were both talking about how, like, they didn't really want to commit to a relationship or whatever, or people were not committed. And I was like, maybe the problem is just that they're 23 and 24, and most people at that age are pretty non-committal. Again, that's just my take. This study does not worry me too much in the state of what it's like to be a single person in New York or any of the other cities that are mentioned.
But yeah, I love that this conversation, because honestly, Anney, I just had a throwback on before I started this show, before I started in, or maybe it was right when I was starting with Sminty, that you, myself, another friend of ours, had a conversation about how we need to normalize women being sexually active and really like loving sex and all of that, on top of the fact that we also had the conversation that we also need to normalize people who do not need sex. Like, this is the beginning of your asexuality conversation on our show, not your journey, just the show, Anney. And I just remember that was such a big point of our general conversation with our friends. Like, it became a whole conversation about, like, we know Sex and the City had like brunch talks where they openly talked about their sex life, and this is so amazing. And then coming back to, but like, let's stop shaming women who are like, no, I'm good without being overly sexual. I love both of those things were going like this flip side of both celebrating, women and sexual desires, but also celebrating in the fact that that's not necessarily a need, like for everyone. Like, I think it's so fun that we do have these conversations because it does open up so many avenues.
It's interesting that you brought up the not having sex element too, because another thing that I keep seeing is there's all these weird like think pieces that keep going around that are like Gen Z is not having as much sex as previous generations. And that always is so weird to me because I'm sort of like, okay, again, what is your metrics for how you're asking people? Because I think all of the things you're describing, they're things that happen in every generation. There are people that decide like, this isn't for me. There are people that decide like, yes, I'd rather wait till marriage. There's people that decide I'm not as into sex. There's people that are asexual, et cetera, et cetera. There's people that just decide to not prioritize dating. And at the same time, like, there's people that are doing all the normal things or, engaging in hookup culture or whatnot. You have your Samanthas and you have your Charlottes in every generation.
Not this Samantha.
But there does seem to be a weird obsession with like, oh, Gen Z isn't having sex. I don't know.
I think in my friend group, my close friends, what I have seen that I feel is different is when we were younger, we all thought we wanted the kids and the marriage, and now I would say at least 50% of my friends are like, actually, I'm really good without that, and or like if that happens, then it's nice. But I'm fine being single or going about my own my work or whatever it is. We did a show on online dating recently-ish, and people were telling me their stories, and I was like, why the would anybody put up with this? This is ridiculous.
Well, that's a perfect segue, because my next section is about online dating culture and online hookup culture. So this is where I think it's interesting, and I would love to hear both of your perspective on this too, because my entire Tinder came out, like Tinder was released in 2012. I was in middle school. My entire teen years, dating apps were kind of seen, they were like a new thing, but they were like becoming normalized. They were becoming a part of the culture. And I think especially they were starting to become very heavily associated with like millennial dating culture. And again, at the time, it was sort of seen as this new novel thing. By the time I was getting to the age where I was starting to date, it was just sort of seen as like the norm. Like, it wasn't like everybody, you turn 18, you download Tinder or Hinge or whatever. And again, I do think something that genuinely is a big change that has happened is that if you look at the statistics now in 2024, Gen Z is using dating apps significantly less than older age groups. When it was launched in 2012, the app was almost entirely geared towards millennials who would have been in that 18 to 25 age group. That now, that 18 to 25 age group is not the main demographic of Tinder. And I will say, I use dating apps. I think dating apps are fun. I think there definitely is like a market for them. But I think just sort of culturally, people are beginning to feel very burnt out from dating apps. And part of this is, I don't know if you guys remember this, but like 4 years ago, like nobody could leave their houses and everybody's social interaction was online.
Mm-hmm. I do remember that.
I know, it was crazy. People seem to be forgetting, so who's to say? I was 20 when the pandemic started. And if you look at the age demographic of Gen Z, a lot of Gen Z was finishing up high school, starting college in their late teens, early 20s. And for a lot of people, again, that is when you start using dating apps. That's when you start like really experimenting with dating and meeting new people. And for a lot of people, all of a sudden, everything was online. you were only really able to meet people online. And so I think it does make sense that Tinder did reach its peak user base in 2021 and 2022. So sort of this time when a lot of people were still following like social distancing rules and whatnot. I'm not going to get into the state of how we're handling COVID now. That's a whole other conversation. But yeah, I think like we need to remember a lot of Gen Z, we spent those sort of formative years when we were supposed to be experiencing these kind of connections for the first time, or really experiencing like serious connections like this for the first time, completely online. I know a lot of people that had like their first relationships start as online relationships during lockdown. And there's nothing wrong with that. I am like all for people that have long distance online relationships. I will say a lot of them are not together anymore. I do know a couple that are still together. So, you know, it does work for some people. But I think a lot of times, like, again, that worked for when that was the only option. But it gets old. And I think part of the burnout with dating apps comes from the fact that we're all just tired, because that was the only option for like a solid 2 years to meet people. That being said, of course, like, I'm sure everybody listening to this knows at least one couple that got together through a dating app. I have a few like really close friends in my life that met their partners through dating apps and are like in healthy, happy relationships. So clearly people are still using these apps to go out and meet people. But also we live in a weird late capitalist hellscape where all of these companies are obsessed with constantly expanding and growing. And I think what they're starting to see is that money is plateauing. These companies like are seeing that their user base is sort of hitting a peak. People are turning to other things and they're kind of panicking, which is how we got earlier this year. There was a weird moment when Bumble decided the best way to advertise to Gen Z was to put up all these billboards that were like discouraging celibacy. It was a weird moment. This was back in April. It's been dubbed the Bumble Fumble, which I kind of love. But yeah, it was, I think like part of the frustration I've been hearing with dating apps is that a lot of these apps are doing these weird sort of marketing techniques to try and get people to stay on. They are messing with the algorithms in a way where they want you to pay to get like the premium access so you can get your best matches, because they need to keep making money, even though the thing that they're doing, they've kind of reached the limit of how much it works.
Yeah, we actually did do, I think, a Monday Mini on the Bumble Fumble, as well as like all of the essentially pay for play. I know that's a very like not taboo way to say it, but like the way that the dating apps have become, like you can't just find a person, but if you want a superior person, you have to pay the apps. And some have actually touted that as a security measure, which is hilarious because they're like, anybody can pay. Like that's the reason black markets exist in the first place. But all of those conversations.
Oh yeah, that's the thing too. Like, look, I'm not going to judge anybody based on whatever they're doing in their dating. Like, I've never paid for a dating app. I don't see a world in which you need to pay for a dating app. We talked about the Bumble Fumble as well on There Are No Girls on the Internet with Bridget. And as well, kind of all of these weird moves these companies are making, and the fact that, you know, something we talked about on that show too is the fact that a lot of people seem to be burnt out with these apps. And I do think part of it is that the apps are sort of making it weird. They're really trying to get you to pay money. They're trying to get you to like subscribe to these premium accounts. But at the same time, I do think it is important to remember, like, yeah, we're all coming off of a significant period of time where we were only interacting with people online, and that gets old. And I think like a lot of people are really craving, you know, meeting people quote unquote naturally, or like in public, or meeting people just sort of spontaneously again. I see you both shaking your heads. I'd love to hear your...
I'm making faces. No, we just don't want to meet people.
Oh, no. Yeah, or that too. That too.
This introvert is very happily staying in my house.
This also, I think, is fascinating because I will say, I was going to say at the top, I'm ultimately somebody who is very much pessimist in my life, but dating is maybe one of the one spaces where I'm like more optimistic, I think, than most people, just because I'm like, I love to meet people. I'm an extrovert. I think like even if it doesn't work out, it's always nice to meet new people and like see who's out there. I guess.
So you are a young extrovert ready to take on the world and meet new people. I think, again, this is a lot to do with like personality, but also changes. And that brings me to this question.
Uh-huh.
Are you going out to meet people if you're not using apps? Is that actually happening? Are you going to bars? Are people going back to bars? Is that a thing?
People are going back to bars. I will say, I think like, see, this is the question I'm getting at too, because I'll say like I'm somebody, I'll go out to bars with friends. There've been a lot of like local events. Again, like I'm queer. I mostly go to events that are focused towards like the queer community, but I think there really has been kind of a emphasis on trying to go out and meet people, at bars or at like, there was like a tweet that I remember seeing that was like, we need to like, we just need to bring back people having like house parties and people meeting at house parties. Just like, that's like, I don't know, go to house parties, you meet friends of friends, you meet like, there's these normal ways that people were like meeting people and dating people. And I think, again, I don't want to blame too much of this on like 2020 and lockdown, but I think we are all still a little bit socially stunted from that. And I think part of the sort of awkwardness around dating right now is coming from that and coming from the fact that we are all like still kind of learning how to be humans again and learning how to interact. However, I will say on the app side of the question, while we're seeing these sort of like old guard, quote unquote, dating apps like Tinder and Hinge and Bumble losing users, or like at least their numbers sort of starting to plateau, something that has changed recently is that there's a lot more like specific apps that are either geared mainly at like hookups or non-traditional sort of relationship styles that have seen like an increase in users. And that I find interesting. So a kind of case study in this is the app Field. If you haven't heard of Field, it was originally launched in 2014 and it was called, I don't know how to pronounce this, Thrinder? It's like Tinder, but they have a 3 instead of the T-I. Like, it's clearly supposed to be like, it's supposed to be like, ooh, threesomes, haha. I don't know, whatever. But it's supposed to be like cheeky. But it's an app that was geared towards people that were interested in kink or polyamory or, exploring multiple partners, etc. Basically any sort of like non-traditional or like taboo type of sex or relationship style. The app is notably like very pro-sex worker and sex positive, and that is kind of why it's seen a lot of people, again, that are either in sex workspaces or like more drawn to less traditional forms of sex or whatever, relationships or whatever, have come to this app. Field is, again, unlike Tinder and Hinge and all these other apps, it's one of the few apps that has seen a significant increase in users the past few years. So there is this really great article from Cosmopolitan UK that was called, "Is Field like a mainstream dating app now?" I love that title as somebody who writes how I talk. But this article points out how the app nearly doubled its revenue in 2023, which, again, very different from the conversation we're having with other apps. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. You guys have kind of talked before on this app about how some of the lingo that traditionally has been more associated with like underground, taboo lifestyles or like sexual preferences or whatever has kind of been making its way into mainstream a lot more. You guys had an episode, I think, earlier this year about like the popularity of using like daddy and mommy all of a sudden as kind of colloquial words, and how that originally had, of course, a very much more explicit, not that it's not sexual now, but at least it seems like it's kind of been toned down a little bit. And I find this sort of, the fact that Field is becoming more popular really interesting, because I think it is kind of in the same vein of that debate over whether it's becoming mainstream because people are more open and more liberated sexually, or it's just becoming a like toned down version of this thing that people think is like alluring and sexy, and then they get there and they're sort of like in over their heads. So going back to that article from Cosmopolitan, there was a quote that I think really summed this up that said, "For some of the kink community, new members are enthusiastically welcomed. For other, Field's recent popularity makes them feel like a, quote, spectacle. One user tells Cosmopolitan UK that some men, quote, see women on there as being easy and too available for sex, and that it has started to feel like, quote, a platform for men to throw around the word dom without understanding it. Another female user agreed, describing Field as, quote, oversaturated with people with no clue, asking overly intimate questions straight off the bat." So again, I that is something that's really interesting to me. Like, I think, again, going back to that idea of like, these things are becoming less taboo. These are things that people are talking about more openly. These are things that are less stigmatized. But what is that actually doing to like the people that are interested in these things, that want to have these communities, that want to have these like more insular communities? And again, another kind of difference with Field that I think is interesting is the article did include this quote from the Field CEO, Anna Kurova, a female CEO. You know, dating apps historically have had a lot of problems with misogyny, so maybe that's a good sign. I don't know. But she's quoted saying, "In terms of scale, there's so much potential for Field, but we have to make sure people are involved for the right reasons and they behave in a certain way. We're not trying to grow at all cost." Which, again, is very different from what Tinder and Hinge and Bumble are sort of prioritizing. And this maybe gives me hope for the fact that maybe like Field won't turn into the next Bumble Fumble situation. But who's to say?
It's interesting to me because I feel when we've done these, when we were looking at what's going on with online dating, something has happened in a lot of cases where, going back to this point of men coming on just to throw around the term dom, where it's like more men than women in a lot of cases, and they'll go to where they think the women are, but they will tell you anything. And I know I'm generalizing, but we've seen this in a lot of cases when it was talking about the statistics and men just being like, well, we must go over here now. Let's try Field. So it's sort of like, I hope that they're able to make the space not become a place where it's just dudes who don't care to understand the truth of it or what it's about. But that is what we've seen in a lot of these instances.
I will say a lot of my conclusions at the end of this are a lot of the problems come down to the fact that men are still very bad at respecting boundaries. But yeah, I think it does kind of bring about the question where it's like, how do you navigate like wanting to, as somebody who's not a cis man, as somebody who's like a woman or just or non-binary or whatever, however you identify, like if you want to be engaging in more casual dating or casual sex or whatever, how do you do that in a way that's also not putting you in a space where like you're with these men that just kind of like the quote said, sort of just see you as like being, quote, easy? I guess this might be a good place to bring up my one big dating app complaint, which is, so I brought up at the top, I only date other queer people. That is, I have another episode I'm doing for you guys at some point about non-binary identity and all of that and kind of how, what that means to me, but also sort of the state of how I think, unfortunately, cis people have sort of taken it and turned it into like a third checkbox on like, you know, if you're like filling out a form and it says like male, female, like they've kind of just made it like a third category instead of really, we're going to get into that on another episode. But I have had this weird, not weird, I guess very expected thing happen this past year where all of my dating apps, I very clearly state, I'm not interested in straight men. I am somebody who I consider myself like transmasculine. I might at some point decide that I want to take more steps to transition physically or, you know, just socially sort of present more as male. So I'm not interested in dating straight men. Because to me, it's like if you're a man and you are only interested in dating women, or you're not interested in dating other cis men, like, to me, that just says that you only sort of see me as like a reduction to what my body is, and you're not really interested in getting to know me as a person or whatever. For some reason, this very, very low bar boundary does not seem to communicate to many men on these dating apps, because I have gotten some of the most ridiculous messages on Hinge, on Tinder, on Field too. I will say one of the most ridiculous ones is that somebody responded to me and said, "I like to be the little spoon. Does that make me straight?" I'm just going to leave that one there. Anyways, and I know I'm not alone here, because this is something that I've seen discussed more and more online. And this is something I've discussed with friends, where I think we're at a weird spot where, and I think, again, I live in a more progressive environment, obviously. So this is kind of more the case and more the norm there, where I think like something else I see. So, and Field is the only app so far that I've seen that is like allowed people to do this, but people like, you can put your sexuality on your profile, and people will say, like, instead of saying that they're like bi or straight, they'll say they're gynosexual, which means they're only attracted to people with like vaginas, which I don't know. Again, to each their own, but to me, that makes me deeply uncomfortable. That is not something I want to hear from somebody that I'm trying to date. I can imagine, especially as like a more binary trans person, that is not something that you want to hear. But yeah, I think like going back to that quote about these men coming in and just calling them, throwing around the word dom and saying that going where they think that it'll be easy to find sex. I think there has been kind of also a trend of men like finding ways to change the language and still be objectifying to anybody that they see as a woman, or quote, like a woman light. Because at the end of the day, I am aware that like some, especially men, see me and just are sort of like, okay, you are a woman with short hair. You are a slightly quirky woman. That is what your gender is. And that's also a weird thing to try and navigate. Like, that is the reason why I'm like...
I have so many questions.
Yes. Opening up the table,
first,
Samantha.
I need to clarify that because of the lag in our recording, that I thought you said dino, as in like D, dog. And I was like, do they just really like dinosaurs? So I was really confused. So I had a kind of boomer moment. Then I realized what you said, and that sounds like very much a man making something up just to sound. So is it just mainly men who put that as their sexuality, or am I assuming?
I will say I've only seen cis men do this so far.
Okay.
Again, to each their own. Maybe somebody is like, that's fine by me. I don't care. To me, that seems weird and reductive. And like at the end of the day, does that not seem more transphobic to just refer like to? You just found like a progressive way of saying, I only want to date.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely transphobia in there, misogyny in there, like way to put a person down to their private parts, like to their genitalia. That's such a weird way. Like, you obviously just said you don't care about that person. You're just using them and their reproductive product. Like, it's such a despicable in every realm. Like, it's sexist, transphobic, like homophobic, all of the things. It's like, what are you? What is wrong with you? Just go buy yourself a fleshlight. This is what you need. Sorry.
Oh.
Well, yeah, it is like, and it's one of those things where I'm like, do you just see queer people as like being more like, again, quote unquote, like easy or like sexually, so you're like, oh, I need to get in there. That's where I got. But I will say too, I do know, I was recently talking to like a friend of mine who's cisgender lesbian, and she was complaining about too how like there keep being cis men that'll show up on her dating app, like kind of like she'll be scrolling through and there'll be like a lot of cis men that'll have their things say that they're lesbians, even though they're identifying themselves as cis men, because they think that's the way to go about meeting women that'll be interested in them somehow.
At that point, I feel like they're just trying to find a way to get rejection. It's like a rejection kink.
Ooh.
maybe it's a kink. I don't know. I'm not gonna kink shame. You know? Oh God, no. This is the like. See, this is bringing me back to at the beginning of the year when I was on talking about all the like TikTok trends and like different like fashion trends and how like ultimately a lot of that was connected to like kink content and like how like especially the trad wife movement, there's a whole weird kind of side of that is related to kink content. Yeah, it's we can't escape, which leads me to my next point, which is we live in a really up world right now. And I think ultimately, like, as much as we want to speculate and talk about how these apps are working and how like social dynamics are changing and how like what people are looking for in dating is changing, at the end of the day, if you're somebody who's trying to date men, trying to date cis men, we need to also look at the culture that is happening with cis straight men right now. And like, I don't know if you guys know this, but we just had a pretty significant presidential election in which, you know, myself and a lot of people were very, very scared and disappointed with the outcome for many reasons. And a big part of that is questions about the future of reproductive rights and bodily autonomy. And, you know, we right now are having this Supreme Court case going on about access to gender-affirming care. Like bodily autonomy is under attack from many different sides right now. And then the other side of that too, again, it's complicated when we talk about the election. I don't want to take away the agency of the fact that there were a lot of women that voted for Trump, particularly white women. There were a lot of white women that voted for Trump. But that being said, just seeing the numbers of men across all demographics, having those numbers go up for men that had voted for Trump, like that's got to be scary. And I think seeing these numbers grow up, seeing how many men are being radicalized by this kind of rhetoric, are being radicalized by these sort of movements, it's no surprise that things like the 4B movement are, you know, getting a lot of traction on social media right now. And, you know, whether or not that's going to be effective or whatnot, I think the fact that it is kind of becoming more prevalent is something that people are talking about, is showing the fact that, yeah, it's hard to date if you're a straight woman and your options are like 60% dudes who have fallen down a weird right-wing rabbit hole. I think something else that was really concerning was right before the election, there was this trend going around of women being like, canceling out my husband's vote. Like, that was weird. That was weird. And I that's another conversation where I think, like, what does that say about you, that you're married to somebody who's doing that? But on a larger scale, yeah, that is very concerning to see, like, what the trends are here.
But yeah, it's definitely a big conversation, and who is controlling a lot of like the narratives, as well as how to kind of like sift through all the information that is being said, because the back and forth in that conversation alone about women saying they have to hide their votes and then say from their husbands, and that being a whole narrative. And then it got flipped into weirdly being like women were lying to their friends because they did not want to be ostracized for voting for Trump. Like, there's so many back and forth in this level. And when I talk about women, they're like the bigger picture seems to be like the white cis women that we have talked about many a times. And then we also see a great big number of people who would be considered allies in trying to help protect these rights. And of course, there's that other, it's weird because it's all over the world. Right now, like, I have been in deep thought and looking through having a conversation about feminism around the world and the states of it, because we're seeing governments collapse. We're seeing the rise of new feminist groups coming up, which is amazing. But we're also seeing bad feminist groups coming at the forefront too. And you're like, oh, no, learn from the US and old school ways. You don't want to do it this way. But it's such a hard conversation because it's both cyclical and new.
Right, exactly. And I think, like, again, this is where I'm kind of, I want to be careful here. I'm not saying like, oh, it's just men that are the problem, because I don't believe in gender essentialism to begin with. I think like, I don't think your gender is the overall determining thing and like what kind of person you end up being. But like, and yeah, there were a lot of women. There were a lot of cis women. There were a lot of straight women. I'm sure there were queer women too that voted for Trump. And that was their decision. And I'm not going to take the agency away from them from saying like obviously they did that. That was their decision. But at the same time, like, what are the rest of us supposed to do? Like, we're all suffering from this. And then, yeah, when you look at the numbers of men like that voted for Trump, the increases are significantly more. And yeah, again, I mean, sex is power and dating is power. One of my favorite Janelle Monáe songs is "Everything is sex except sex, which is power." This is a lot of ways like how marginalized people, how women, like that is the way that we have shown power historically. And again, like I think that is why it makes sense that we're seeing this increase in conversations about stuff like 4B and like more extreme movements, whether or not it's going to be effective. Again, kind of going back to what you're saying, I think we are in danger of sort of like falling into very turfy, gender essentialist type rabbit holes that are just going to ultimately end up hurting all of us. But at the same time, like I understand why this reaction is happening. Like if you're looking into the world and this is the stories you're reading about, like all of these men that are voting to take away your bodily autonomy, you're seeing, you know, Nick Fuentes get on Twitter right after the election and say, like, your body, my choice, and hearing about, like, middle school boys shouting your body, my choice at, like, teachers and young women. Like, that is terrifying. And I think we can't talk about the fact that something really weird is happening with dating and dating culture without talking about the fact that something weird is just happening with men in general and the radicalization of young men.
Because honestly, on the other scale to this, because we're talking about the Gen Z or dating, a queer person dating, non-binary queer person dating, in New York and all these things, and then the bigger conversation of like we being the old people, love seeing things change and people understanding that things are on spectrums now and it's not just black or white or, you know, A or B. But then also seeing like a big chunk of, and this is sad for y'all, Gen Z boys voting for Trump. Like I honestly was really shocked by that. Almost as shocked as like, not really, but like Latino voters also voting. Not really, but you know, on that level of like, I really thought that there was this big shift, but it's not changed that much.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, same. And like, I think part of that, like, I sort of naively hoped that, again, this is a thing where I was like, oh, see, it seems like our generation is so much more understanding about like gender diversity and, you know, sexuality being much more fluid and whatnot. And then, or not, maybe not. Or even if that's not the main, like, even if there's somebody who maybe doesn't believe that and, you know, voted for other reasons, they're still at least saying that they don't care enough about these issues to make it like a priority. So yeah, it's weird. It is weird. And I think this was sort of the like, it was fun writing this episode and delving into all the like, you know, the way that we're meeting and how that's changing and the way that, you know, conversations about sex and sexuality, like the ways they are becoming more open. But then at the same time, it's kind of like, oh, now we can't talk about this without addressing the fact that, yeah, it is going to be weird to date if your dating pool includes a bunch of men that don't see you as like a human being. So I don't know. And I don't think we should be settling for that. That is the last thing we should be doing. So clearly things, you know, we're always going to need a feminist movement. We're always going to need a queer liberation movement. And this is why.
Guess it's our job security now, huh?
So much to talk about, but at what cost?
That's true. I hate when people tell me that. It's like, oh, you'll have plenty to talk about. I'm like, I kind of would rather
not
have that much.
So, on that note, I do ultimately have hope. I do ultimately feel optimistic. Again, like I talked about at the top of this episode, I'm in my mid-20s. This is kind of the time when this is supposed to be happening. You know, bringing it back to Sex and the City. They're all in their mid-30s. And I am grateful that despite like all the things that I just talked about, like I do live in a world where I'm not expected to settle down in my mid-20s, and it's not like looked down upon because that I don't want to do that. I am very, very grateful for the fact that like we, you know, there has been all this buildup in feminist movements and queer liberation movements and whatnot to change these dynamics around sex and gender. So again, I don't, at the end of the day, I don't think it's a bad time for dating. I don't think it's any worse than it like has been historically. I just think it's changing. And I think there's new things that we need to watch out for. Seems so intense, but really it is. Like there's new things we need to watch out for. There's new ways that, again, we're seeing men kind of and I keep saying men, but, you know, it's anybody. I'm sure there's plenty of toxic women and non-binary people out there too. But yeah, I don't know. Like things are changing. The social dynamics are changing. We are all still, again, I think socially recovering from being stuck at home for like 2 years. And I think ignoring that is like a big blind spot. Like clearly a big part of the problem is, again, the fact that we're all still relearning how to like exist in a society or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. Again, at the end of the day, despite all this being said, I still feel pretty optimistic.
Okay.
At the end of the day, like things are changing. Yeah.
Sounds like it's weird but hopeful.
Weird but hopeful. Yeah, exactly. There we go. Describes a lot of my life.
Tagline.
It'll be my autobiography.
I think COVID messed us up a lot worse than we're admitting it did.
Oh, yeah.
And so, yeah, I completely agree with you. So, yeah. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. We do have some other episodes planned with you, and definitely another Sex and the City episode now that you've seen the whole thing.
I know.
Yes. But in the meantime, where can the good listeners find you?
You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, now on Blue Sky, although I haven't really used it yet, at Pat Not Pratt. That's PATTNOTPRATT. If you want to follow me on TikTok for like the 2 weeks that we have TikTok still, you can find me at Hot Topic Dad. It's Hot Topic like the store, and then just Dad. It's mostly cosplay stuff, but you know what? Whatever. If you want to see that, it's all the app's about to be gone anyways. But yeah.
Yes, definitely go check Joey out and all those places, listeners, if you haven't already. I'm so glad you were able to come on. I know you're a little sick, and also so glad we got to finally meet.
Yes. Oh my God. Cool. Of course.
In the meantime, if you would like to contact us, you can. You can email us at stuffmediamomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter and Blue Sky at MomStuffPodcast, and on Instagram and TikTok at Stuff One Never Told You. We are also on YouTube. We have a TeePublic store, and we have a book you can get wherever you get your books. Thanks as always to our super producer Christina, our executive producer Maya, and our contributor Joey.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff One Never Told You is a production by iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.